Good morning. Felicia, thank you so much for that talk. I really connected with a lot of the message behind the inclusivity that we need to establish in the work that we do. I may sound like somebody from America, but I'm actually from Malaysia. I was born and bred, lived there in Kuala Lumpur for about 20 years. But I've kind of jumped around a lot. Spent a few years in the States, and then I've been living in London for about almost 10 years. And I've brought with me a lot of kind of interesting backgrounds and experiences. And now what I'm trying to figure out, at least in the subject of my talk, is how to translate my experiences as a designer to influence the way, to translate the solutions that we have in our designs with our teams, with people we work with, and ultimately kind of help kind of facilitate those solutions out into the real world. And so hopefully this is kind of like a slightly different response, look at a different perspective of how we as designers can effectively make our solutions more accessible to the organizations that we work with, so that they can effectively translate the right intentions into the products and services that we build. So the title of the talk is called Triggers, Traps, and Trojan Horses. And it's a little mnemonic that I came up with to kind of signify all of the different things that I think of when we design for the context of large organizations. I work for a company called Elsevier at the moment. I'm a principal user experience designer, and Elsevier is famous for publishing scholarly and scientific books, journals, but they also do a lot of digital work, such as a search engine for research papers and things like that. I've also done a lot of consulting work with large companies, and also before that, I used to work as a developer primarily for telecoms companies, which are monstrous organizations. And so a lot of my experiences are reflected from having done work in those contexts. I'm also a bit of a super volunteer with UX communities. I've been serving on the board of the IXDA for about 4 years now. I also run IXDA London, and I've been doing that for almost 7 years. And I also contribute at a regional level. So I'm looking at the context of communities in the scale of in the context of large organizations, and what that really means from a community and practice perspective. What I'll do is structure this talk around a series of heuristics, which are essentially just kind of rules of thumb that I fall back on when I think of doing work in the context of large orgs. And the reason why I think this is important is because the work that we do to translate that work across multiple teams and systems and policies and processes is very complex. And we need to find a way of kind of simplifying that, of making sense of that in a structured way that helps us really navigate that space, and especially with people, and people are very complex. So I'll take you through these heuristics, but I'll start with a story, or rather a parable. And this parable comes from an old Harvard Business Review article that was published in 1962. It's written by a man called Elias Porter, who was an American psychologist. And in his this article, he introduces the story of a restaurant owner who's basically been experiencing some staff or employee problems in his restaurant. He was trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way to figure this out? So he brings in some external consultants of different backgrounds, psychologists, sociologists, some different ones, and they can't quite agree on the diagnosis of the problem because everyone's comes in with different perspectives. But they all sort of suggested the use of a kitchen spindle to solve the problem. And what the kitchen spindle allows the restaurant staff to do is to kind of put the orders on the spindle, and then the kitchen staff is able to kind of know what's coming up. There's a sequence of the orders that's signified by the way the orders are being placed on the spindle. The managers don't have to deal with waitresses arguing with kitchen staff. The kitchen staff are getting pissed off with the waitresses and so on, and then leaving basically in a bout of anger. And so all of this somehow is able to resolve all of these interpersonal issues that the restaurant owner was experiencing. And so it's just a simple story that the article author, Mr. Porter, used to kind of elevate this idea that we should be trying to solve problems from a systems perspective, and that he called systems design, and which he describes as a problem in the division of work between men and machines and how they are related to one another. Obviously, as designers, this really resonates with us because that's very much the space that we operate in, and that's the kind of symbol or metaphor that keeps coming back to my mind when I think of work in the context of large orgs. That we're essentially trying to create these solutions to facilitate behaviors, to facilitate decision making in the context of teams, of groups, of departments, and so on. And obviously, if we were to scale that out, that gets really, really complex. So we won't be able to solve everything, but at least we'll start to begin to understand the nature of the work that we are doing, or the work that other people are doing, and to start putting in places structures or solutions that help facilitate that work, so that our ideas, our combined solutions and our ideas can translate that effectively to our customers and our end users. I'll touch a little bit on this heuristic of shaping organizations. And I don't mean this to say that we are change agents as independent designers. I don't mean to kind of go in to really drastically re-engineer businesses or organizations from the inside. That's not really kind of what we were set up to do. And so rather than calling it kind of change management or whatever that is, I'd rather think of it as kind of shaping the way organizations work in ways that gets established collaboratively. And it's a lot of it is about how we see the organization from within ourselves, and also how people within the organization see the organization. So where if I'm an individual and what's my role within the context of the organization? What does it look like if I look at it from the outside? What if I look at it from the context of my colleague, and so on and so forth? Another way of looking at it is, all right, if I'm a designer and I'm intending to design for the purpose of translating my solutions across an organization, I might start to look at it from the lens of designerly skills. So I might translate and almost reappropriate things that I know of within my design release tool set, and apply that onto an org context. So users become employees, touch points become internal systems and processes, and so on and so forth. So I'm trying to draw parallels where I can hopefully apply some of my abilities as a designer into an org context, because they're users as well. They will be users of our platforms because they'll need to work on it to then shape the experiences that are used to engage with our customers. And there are also people who make decisions on those products. Another way to look at it is that the org is essentially kind of like one giant machine, and we as designers need to figure out what's inside that machine that makes a difference or influences the way our touch points work. So I've already kind of alluded to this notion before, but if we don't really understand what goes on inside, it becomes really difficult to really know where the levers are to impact or influence change. You might also want to look at it from the context of how and why people within the organization do things. So are they driven by some sort of higher level goal or higher level mission? How does that really shape the way people think and do things within the context of an organization? All these things are basically just ways of seeing. And some of us have all these ideas, these concepts already baked inside because it's been informed by our experiences or from working with clients or working with colleagues. But that's just a starting point. I think it's really important to step back and really think, how do we really see organizations, both from the inside and the outside? How do we, and what does it mean from the context of other people within the organization as well? Because that essentially is what makes up the reality, because that informs how we behave. When it comes to actually doing the work, I think it's good to then start to work your way through the organization to figure out what's going on across different departments, across different groups, across different teams. And on this recent project that I've been working on, we started out engaging with a series of stakeholder interviews because, number one, I was new, so I've been in this role for about 6 months. And even though there was a lot of historical literature on the problem area that we were working on, I just felt like the best way to quickly get to the heart of the problem and get a really rounded understanding of the problem was to speak to people, because oftentimes when you're working with large organizations, there will be way more than one hand that touches this problem or product or idea, and I bet you almost everyone will have an opinion of it, or will have some experiences navigating that problem space, or have had made decisions in the past associated to that product. And so what we did was we interviewed something like 35 stakeholders across the business, from senior leadership to people doing the execution work, technologists, product people, so on and so forth. And that was really, really valuable, because that essentially allowed us to really prioritize and understand the essence of what our wants and needs were as an organization, which then allows me to then have much easier conversations with people, because it does resonate with them. It's almost like playing back the sum total of those conversations back to people, and that gets embedded back into my presentation slides. It gets embedded back into the solutions that we work on within on the product in our product teams. And so when I'm navigating this space, I'm trying to think of, okay, how can I make sense of this? And that was what inspired me to come up with the title of the talk. So I'll break that down for you, this idea of triggers, traps, and Trojan horses. So a trigger is something that influences or affects the way people within organizations work. It could be things like corporate values, they could be mission statements, but basically they're there, and people talk about it, they vocalize it, it's evident, it's observable, and you can see how it affects people's decisions. You can see how it kind of changes the way they think and do things. It's part of the culture, but I'm trying to find a source of that that thing. And so at least I'm at least acknowledging that this is part of the overall solution, and it needs to be factored into the work that we do. And then there's traps, and these are things when I'm going around interviewing people or going around working with the organization, I'm trying to figure out if there are things that we've been doing that somehow doesn't quite feel right. And it may not feel like it may not even be noticed by the people that I speak to, but maybe I'm sensing that things are going in circles, or maybe people are adopting practices or processes in a kind of methodical way and not really reflecting on what the outcomes are, or whether it's really yielding the benefits that it's supposed to be doing. And an example of this is a client that I worked for a few years ago came to us wanting to get us to help them to develop a design system internally for their teams. And the whole objective was to help them make their user experiences more consistent, because they're all kind of broken up into different departments, and this design system would help them align between the different teams to create more consistent experiences on their websites. That's all perfectly fine, common sense. Let's help them make a design system. But when I started talking to people who work within this organization, it became really evident that it wasn't just that the design system was necessary, but also the understanding of the work that was going on in the organization. So if you have a design system, but you don't really know how different people are using it, does that help? Because then, you're sort of in your team, plugging away, using the design system, but then you're not really sure that how this other team is also translating their solutions into their different products and solutions. And so what I ended up proposing was an internal site, or an internal space for those designers, those product people, to not just get access to these design systems, which things like guidelines and patterns and assets and components and stuff like that, but I also built in a space for them to see the work that was taking place within the organizations. So they would come to this page and they would see a space for different places to go to for different roles. So, but the way that we would orientate them is to say, have a look at the work to see how the design system is actually effectively translating onto those products, and then get a better understanding of how you might take those learnings back to your teams, because at the end of the day, the consistency is a social endeavor. It's not just by way of taking a set of patterns and libraries and then, just like Lego, producing the end result. And the last heuristic is this idea of Trojan horses. And these are external influences that sort of creep into the organization and somehow embed themselves in people's minds, and they start to infiltrate teams and products. They get into slide decks, they get into adopted practices, and somehow it becomes a thing. And they don't necessarily have to be bad. So although Trojan horses have been, it sounds like it's sort of a bad thing that happens, but it could also be a really good thing. So an example that I'll use is recently we have a number of senior leaders in our company, and particularly product people, have been adopting the methods that are found in this book called Inspired by Marty Kagan. It's a book about how the top Silicon Valley companies do things, and there's basically goes into detail of how to emulate them. And so a lot of the content from the book has started creeping into a lot of our product approaches, and it started to appear on presentations. It started to appear in our language. It's now kind of seeping in across the business. It's not part of our official sort of set of methodologies or approaches within the company, but it's an example of something that's sort of coming in from the outside, and it's really impacting the way parts of our organizations do things. And that's, if you look at Agile, for example, that's essentially how it started with a lot of organizations, right? But now we look at it like, oh yeah, everyone's doing Agile. And sometimes, it can turn for the worse, and tracing back the history of how that's ended up in your organization can really give you some interesting clues as to how these external influences have developed and been adopted across your organization. And that way you can kind of sort of reverse engineer and have more educated discussions with your teams, with people within the organization, to really question whether something needs to happen that way, or whether you should maybe try something different. So that's triggers, traps, and Trojan horses. Just really quick ways, at least ways that I think of making sense of what goes on within an organization without trying to get too complex. I'll talk a little bit about scaffolds. So I'll use the idea of scaffolds as a metaphor for doing work across teams, across large areas, where, like, multiple groups, multiple projects, even multiple levels across the organization. I like to think of scaffolds as a way of approaching the design work across large spaces, and I'll get into what that means. So if we were to think of designing it as a large scale, one good way of thinking about it is it's a bit like eating a building-sized cake. You kind of have to break it down into smaller parts, and then break that down even further into smaller parts. And you need to figure out, all right, so now I've broken it down. How am I going to start eating it? Where do I start? And along the way, you might have different strategies. You might think of different approaches, but then you have to keep in mind that you got to avoid a situation where the building sort of collapses on you. It's sort of a weird idea, but that's the only one I could really come up with to really describe, from my experience anyway, the work of designing products in the context of large orgs. And we might be familiar with a lot of tools and diagrams and frameworks like this to facilitate design work with clients, with teams, with people. to move it along, right? And to me, these are all kind of tools which I use the scaffold metaphor to describe. And the reason why I think of these things as scaffolds is because they're kind of like transitional. They're not permanent, really. There are a lot of different ways to describe the work that gets done. Like for example, even describing the work of agile or lean. There are so many different diagrams out there, different ways to describe the domain of UX, blah blah blah. And there's just like no one size fits all. And so I treat them as sort of temporary or transitional things, intended to facilitate discourse, problem solving within a sort of a limited time frame. And I think scaffolds are also a great metaphor because it's like how a building scaffold works. You set it up and you sort of go through the scaffold to allow you to scale up a construct to work on it. You're building the structure up as it goes along, and you initially need someone to help you figure out. All right, you've shown me this framework or whatever it is. Help me understand what that means. Help me understand how to translate what I'm doing and what you're doing to the actual work that we need to accomplish. And then the structure also really informs how that work should be done or how we should navigate the space. And sometimes it does get adopted as like permanent things, and that becomes practice. But then by that point, the scaffolds, can be taken down or it can be replaced by something else. And I really like to use the metaphor of scaffolds to really think of ways we structure work across an organization. The double diamond is a really good example of a scaffold because it's a little bit abstract, but it's at the right level of granularity to help me explain to people the work of design, and to really just separate that there's a portion of the work in design that's all about definition, and that's really crucial to the work that we do, which is slightly separate to execution. And I'll often make the point that this construct isn't intended to convey a linear approach. Like you have to do this in one phase before you do it in other. Sometimes it's cyclical. And the way I would determine success of whether a scaffold's being adopted is whether it comes back to you in terms of feedback, in terms of how people are adopting that scaffold, especially when you're not around. If you know that, if you've kind of gone around the building or the organization and you started doing a roadshow of the work that you've been doing, and you're using these frameworks and you're communicating effectively in the right way, and you hear people starting to emulate and echo the stuff that you're doing, that's a really good thing, right? I think that in order to be successful at your work within large orgs, you have to be humble and almost embrace opposites. It's paradoxical, but oftentimes you'll find yourself in a position of strength where you're the design expert. You're there to consult, and you're there to help people figure out how to do things in a design-lead way. But oftentimes you're not. And this could translate across so many different spaces, and I've just listed a few down here. Sometimes it's about taking different perspectives from the top to looking at things to the bottom, translating things from the bottom up, almost juggling between the two from one instance to another. Sometimes it's about looking at things from a group perspective versus an individual. And that's the work that we do as designers. We translate things that are holistic down to the very specifics and the very detailed work that we do at the interaction level. And we have to do the same across an organization. we're almost using the organization as a design machine, and to be able to translate that, or at least navigate that space, we have to really embrace these extremes to do that effectively. Because in some ways, no one in the company has that singular role. Everyone's gets sort of boxed up into different silos and roles and departments and groups. Everyone's got a bit of a function. So there isn't really one person or a role or an individual that kind of helps traverse across that entire space. And so sometimes you have to kind of take up that mantle as a designer to do that work, to tie the loose pieces, to go in through the gaps, help connect things, build bridges, and so on. And it's a lot of time spent listening and observing, understanding, and traveling to places that you may never think of going. So all this sounds really complex and daunting, and oftentimes it can feel really disorienting, especially when you've thought, you've gone to a place where you thought you figured out everything. You figured out a strategy of where you want to go, and you're happy that you want to translate that across your stakeholders. And tell them, this is an exciting direction that you want to take it. And then you realize, oh, okay, I haven't actually spent time with this particular group, and this completely undermines everything that you've done. So you got to really take it with caution, and I think it's really important to kind of ground yourself in the fundamentals, because you'll get tripped up. You'll get tripped up and think, oh yeah, the design should always be for users. I'm a user experience designer. This is what I do. Let's fixate on the user. Everything else can sort itself out. But then you realize, actually, no. That team is going to be, making decisions on this part of the product. This team is going to use that interface to publish that piece of content, and so it just runs chaos. So you got to really ground yourself in understanding what is really important, and in the context of design, that can span across a lot of different spaces. I try to challenge myself to read as much as I can, even way beyond the context of UX, because that's really, really crucial for me to be able to have the skills and perspectives to help me translate what I'm thinking of or what I'm working on with other people, and vice versa. I need to really understand people within the organization. The same way I spend understanding users, understanding contexts of the audiences that I'm designing for, I need to understand people within the business. And so I force myself to kind of step into those shoes through books, and also by validating my assumptions with other people, with communities, testing my assumptions, checking to see if the way I'm approaching things or the way I think of things really makes sense, because there are a bunch of people out there as well who are experiencing very similar things. So that's a good way of kind of balancing. You've gotten the hit knowledge from the books. How does it actually play out in the real world? And the only real way to do it is to actually test it out with other people, because at the end of the day, this is a social discipline, and it's a reflective practice, and the work that we do informs back how we should improve things moving forward. So those are the heuristics, and an exercise that I did just to kind of wrap things up was to apply or really assign a word to describe the benefits or the effects of these heuristics. So the parable really is just, to me, a little symbol or metaphor. I think of just a simple device in my mind I can conjure up to help me consider the work of design within the context of large orgs. And then the second one I talked about was essentially just ways of seeing. And that's an active sort of effort rather than just relying back on our kind of unconscious understandings of organization. We need to really critically, explicitly state how we're seeing organizations. The third one is about sensing. When we start to navigate the space, we're trying to figure out what it is that makes the organization tick, how they do things, what are the traps, and what are the external influences. Structuring, how do we facilitate work across scale? Embracing opposites, at the end of the day, I think is really about enabling scale because those perspectives help us to understand the scale of that problem space so that we can essentially intentfully design for those conditions. And then the last one is about sanity because you need to keep yourself grounded. And that's essentially what facilitates the work in the right way. And it's good for everyone, I think. Everyone really appreciates that the due diligence and the work that you've done to help connect the dots and empathize with the way people do things. And we're all very different. Although I think everyone here in the room identifies themselves as a designer, the world is much bigger than that. And we're definitely not at the center of the world. That's it. That's the six heuristics that I've used to describe the work of design within the context of large orgs, and that's I would love to hear back from you. Thanks.